Hi there, welcome back to 19th century art. In this lecture, we're looking at mass consumption of entertainment, the American inventions that made the modern world possible, and where they came from and how they impacted our ideas about art and culture. Much of what we have as our earliest mass entertainment were the magic lanterns. People would go to see magic lantern shows where images would be projected onto the wall as someone told a story. Or if you were wealthy enough, you might own one of these yourself. It became a way to entertain people seated around a fairly dim candle behind a lens. In the 17th century, they had already begun as entertainment, but it was during the 19th century they were used also as educational tools. Originally, they were hand-painted on glass or oiled paper. After 1820, the manufacturing of hand-colored print slides started. Another popular toy developed in 1834 was the zoetrope. This ingenious invention was simply a drum that spun with slots along the upper edge that, as you peered into the slots, the paper drawing on the inside would flicker and allow you to see the various transformations of the characters as action seen in one place. So we could see here a tiger leaping through a cage onto the back of a horse, as in a circus act. What made the zoetrope such a wonderful device was that a whole group of people could sit around it, and from whatever vantage point, as it spun, they could all see the same action. The animations that were produced in the zoetrope were repetitive and exceedingly brief, but the fun was that you could buy various zoetrope strips that were easily inserted into the machine, or you could make your own. And this was part of the fun of this new child's toy. The idea of animation really takes off with the way photographs could be put into a sequence. And this was originally done for a scientific proof set forward by Edward Muybridge so that Leland Stanford and his horse track could win a bet, as he was determined to prove that at one point in a horse's gallop, all four legs of the horse move upward and off the ground. This is not the way horses were typically depicted in pictures, and so it was not seen, and there was no way to prove it until you created this device by Edward Muybridge, which allowed, as the horse moved through the scene, the cameras put in a row would trip and capture the image of the horse in motion at various points in its stride. So if you put all of this together, you can actually see how these individual pictures depict the movement of the horse. Muybridge took this idea and began to develop a whole series of images of human and animal locomotion that he put together in a book called The Human Figure in Motion. Muybridge's book contained almost 5,000 photographs, and it illustrated 163 different types of action. This was a fairly famous one called A Nude Descending a Staircase. If that title sounds somewhat familiar to you, some 40 years later, Marcel Duchamp would create a painting by that very same name, Nude Descending a Staircase, as a kind of futurist painting that shows the various aspects of that rhythmic movement superimposed on top of a single painting. The idea that Muybridge set into motion was making a film camera that could be used to capture a series of pictures on a single emulsified film. The people who really brought this complex tool to work were the Lumiere brothers. The other person who really revolutionized the movie industry was Thomas Edison, who was the first to commercially exhibit motion pictures in the United States, and he premiered at the Kinetoscope Parlor in New York City in 1894. He had 10 short films. Each were no more than a minute long. So we can see here one of his typical films, a man sneezing. Over his lifetime, he made 1,200 films, and 57 of them were feature-length films. The important development that occurred in American popular entertainments was the rise of the American newspaper. In the United States, there really wasn't that much news. Everything was fairly straightforward, and much of the competition between the newspapers meant that there was a lot of editorial differences, but the general substance of each newspaper was relatively similar. It wasn't until Benjamin Day, in his newspaper The Sun, that he decided to take a risk and publish a really fantastical story about an astronomer who has discovered life on the moon. These series of stories that were published in his newspaper, collectively described as the moon hoax from 1835. So the sensationalism of this news was brought about because it was very difficult to disprove at the time, and that the astronomer that he put into question was a British astronomer, and then he claimed that this discovery had been done in South Africa, far and away from anybody that could easily fact check any of the sources. The story described a population of bat-winged people and bear-like people that lived in towns, and went on to extraordinary detail about the nature of the telescope that could capture these vivid images from Earth. The moon hoax was eventually proved incorrect, but it didn't harm the Sun's readership. They just thought it was all good fun, and he dramatically improved his subscriptions through this ruse. At this point, American newspapers realized that readers were more interested in being entertained than they were about reading factual news. And from this point forward, there is a decided movement away from observable factual news and more into entertainment and commentary. Many of the magazines employed illustrators to create vivid images of the news of the day. Thomas Nast was one of the more celebrated cartoonists, caricaturists, illustrators at this time. Here you see his drawing of St. Nick visiting the Civil War soldiers from Harper's Weekly. This is the first depiction of St. Nick as the jolly old elf. This was something that Thomas Nast's depiction of him that became so iconic that really sold us on the idea of Christmas, which was generally not such a popular holiday because it mostly involved a lot of drinking and overeating. Political caricatures were one of Thomas Nast's mainstay, and he really roasted the Tammany Tigers of New York City Hall. Here we see Boss Tammany in his largesse like a Roman emperor. He is making trouble in New York. These kinds of vivid caricatures really brought the people's attention to what was going on in the world. Magazines such as Puck and Atlantic Monthly become an absolute mainstay today. Were able to really capture readers with vivid stories and beautifully illustrated tales. Many of the artists here worked to capture images that really summed up what was happening in the world at large. A.B. Frost is one of those really amazing cartoon artists who had just a wonderful and vivid way of drawing. We see here his parody of the old artist who does not believe the photographs of horses trotting that he has seen published and believes his depiction of a horse that has come down from tradition is actually what they look like. Palmer Cox was a fabulously popular caricaturist who came up with a series of stories and pictures that captivated the imagination from Nicholas Magazine in 1883. He had a whole troupe of these brownies, which you imagine sort of like these diminutive fairies that were taking over the world when everyone else was asleep, and they would pretend to be humans. This was a delightful way of looking at ordinary things from the vantage point of these diminutive outsiders. There was no distinct characters that were named in the brownie troupe, but eventually certain hats and clothing styles pointed them out to belong to different ethnic groups in the United States. Palmer Cox brownies had numerous adventures that were collected and resold as books. Brownies were so popular, the camera company Kodak decided to name their new popular personal camera the Brownie camera, and without paying any royalties to Palmer Cox. This was possible because Palmer Cox, while he owned the copyright to his own creations, there was no real legal basis for someone taking something that was similar and creating something new with it. That is an idea that appears later in the 20th century. Newspapers, in order to compete, began to create flashier and wilder visual spreads. And the opportunity to do this came with these offset color lithography. Now, we've talked about lithography before. What makes offset color lithography so wonderful is that it takes a roller across the ink stone, which gathers the ink up and then sets it down on the paper. This makes it easier and faster, not trying to bring paper directly onto the stone, but by moving the image, it created faster, better quality images that transfer from the stone by the roller to the paper, created the opportunity for mixing colors and generating some really extraordinary images. And this was also the way of bringing photographs, the technology of photographs, into illustration more directly in photogravure. So a picture could be translated into something that could be printed. Joseph Pulitzer, in his newspaper, The New York World, was the first to realize that Sunday was a time of leisure, and it was a time when people had an opportunity to sit around and their family, and that they would all like something nice, light, and entertaining to read. So he created the Sunday Color Supplement. And this was this magazine tucked into the newspaper on Sunday that would be this bonus visual treat that people could pore over for hours. It had gossip, it had fashion, it had sports, it had all the stuff that people wanted to catch up on the weekend. The other major improvement in the newspaper was the linotype press. Up until its invention in 1884, newspapers had to sort and assemble every single letter that was printed in type. And then after the paper was done, they'd have to take apart each and every letter they had assembled and then resort it and then put it all back together for the next day's paper. This limited the length of papers. Papers could really only be about 8 pages per daily paper. That was a lot of manual labor. This is where we get the phrase being out of sorts, because a sort is a single letter type, and nothing was more frustrating to the typesetters when they were literally out of sorts. They literally didn't have enough of a particular letter to finish a line of type. This all changes with the linotype press, which was this incredibly huge and dangerous and insanely complicated machine, which allowed someone to take the text that needed to be composed, type it onto the machine, and the machine would then create from that line a lead piece of type. A single line then was a single length of type, and then all of that type would then be just sorted out for line by line. That meant that instead of working letter by letter, you now worked by line by line. And once you were done with the type of the day, you took your old lines and you threw them back into the hopper. They melted down and you were ready to create the next day's newspaper. So this machine dramatically sped up the use of words in the newspaper. It allowed for people to create whole lines of unique type quickly and easily. The artist who really captured the day in the newspapers on the Sunday supplement was Richard F. Occult, who worked for the New York World, and he began a regular series talking about these poor inner city kids, and it talks about her brother dying, and what was the tragedy was he died just before Thanksgiving, and he never got to have a decent meal. So this really rather dark humor of poverty in the city was a way to look at the real problems, but also to show how the resilience of the kids in those cities. The kid in the back with the nightshirt with the sort of dumb expression on his face, he became a regular feature in Richard Occult's comics. He liked putting him in the comic because he created a sort of visual interest that people scanning the page would see that kid in his yellow shirt and they would think, oh, look at that. I wonder what that dumb kid's thinking. And he was just sort of there in the background, as you can see here in Hogan's Alley, January 1896 in New York World. We have the kids playing at golf. And of course, golf is an upper class game that these kids are just violently whacking each other with their sticks. Anchoring this whole chaotic scene is our really idiotic looking kid in the yellow shirt with a big stain on it. We kind of gravitate to that. And all the other activities sort of swirl around the yellow kid. Well, the yellow kid became a thing. I mean, people were starting thinking, well, who is this yellow kid? What's he all about? People began marketing on the yellow kid in a big way. We had harnesses for horses, we had oranges, grapefruits, and tangerines, we had ginger wafers, you name it, toys, chewing gums, puppets, all kinds of things became all about the yellow kid. And Occult, while he liked the notoriety and his feature became larger and more spectacular with that popularity, and he made more money with this, he made nothing on all these derivative things. People were just taking the image of the yellow kid and putting it on whatever they wanted. Again, the copyright laws didn't really protect this kind of thing. So in McFadden's Row of Flats, we see the yellow kid in his full glory. He is front and center, and we have this great wild scene of the kids on the block doing all kinds of crazy antics. And now the voice of the yellow kid is written on his shirt. It becomes like a placard he's wearing. And you can see how this exciting image is used to really have us zero in on what's going on in this scene. And of course, because it's Sunday, this complicated picture with all these different bits of words here and there are all about, poring over the image and seeing all the little funny jokes that are tucked away inside the picture. This is a lot of work to generate a picture like this every single week. And I believe it was Occult's intention to try and find something simpler. And so he created these series of pictures, eliminating the background, and then using this device known as the speech bubble to create a comic about this newfangled invention, the phonograph. And here we see the yellow kid with his own words on his shirt. But then the voice of the phonograph is speaking to him, and he's interacting with it, his words on his shirt, until finally the phonograph pops open and a parrot comes out, speaking in a speech bubble. And the yellow kid is so surprised, his own words come out of his mouth. Now, this sounds like kind of a crazy comic, but if you remember, for almost 100 years, speech bubbles weren't really being used. And so suddenly we have the speech bubble come front and center into a comic that is sequential, so that we're seeing this moment-to-moment action unfolding over time with speech bubbles. This is it, folks. This is where we look at what we now call the modern comic. It looks a lot like what we've always seen on the Sunday papers. This character who's been repeated and is popular and well known is now speaking in speech bubbles. And it's all due, really, to this invention called the phonograph. Thomas Edison's phonograph was developed 20 years earlier, in 1877, and remarkably, it was Occult who had a job with Edison at this time to do drawings of Edison's inventions so that he could promote them to the public. So Occult was very familiar with Edison's work. And he brings this about as a way to talk about the way we're changing the way we think about voice. This was the thing that made the phonograph so mysterious. People didn't understand where the voices were coming from. No one had ever experienced a voice that was disembodied from a person. And so the phonograph captures the voice independent of reading it on a page. And you have this voice now coming back to you as this living presence. And this was so uncanny for people. They would hear concerts and music and their loved ones talking to them. And all of this was something that really brought back the unique dynamics that happen in a human voice. People began to see the voice as something distinct from the printed word. And I believe this is why we have speech bubbles from this point forward. So people started to hear voices as voices and not just as another kind of written text. Now, Occult's yellow kid fell on hard times. The Spanish-American War was heating up, and the idea of yellow menace, that was this time the Spanish flag had yellow, and so all things yellow were now demonized by these very newspapers. So the yellow kid was also killed because Occult was frustrated by the fact that he couldn't make money off all these residuals that people were using of this character. So he went on to make some other characters. Newspapers all over the country began to realize the extraordinary popularity of their Sunday color supplement and the comics within them. And so they began to bulk up on illustrators and cartoonists, and this drive to create the best and most elaborate Sunday color supplement was on. This, in turn, devastated the magazines such as Puck and Nicholas, which had otherwise been quite an important mainstay in American life. Now, the Sunday color supplement was supreme. And the important realization that came from this was that people bought newspapers just to read the comics. The guy who really took off with this idea of sequential action and characters talking in speech bubbles was Rudolf Dirks and his Katzenjammer Kids. Dirks was working at a paper. William Hearst returned from Germany, and he had in his hand this book that he'd found that was Max and Moritz by Wilhelm Busch. Remember Max and Moritz, those two naughty boys? Well, he gives this book to Dirks, and he says, I think there's a comic strip in this. Why don't you see what you can do with it? And Dirks ran with it. He created these two naughty boys getting into trouble and their parents having to spank them. And it was hugely popular. Rudolph Dirk's Katzenjammer Kids. Now, the word Katzenjammer is a slang word used to describe a hangover. So it means there's like a howling cat. And this is the way in which the early humor of the Katzenjammer Kids was about the immigrant poor. It was about these naughty boys. And it was kind of violent and it's a little bit low class. But this is the stuff that was real to people in the newspaper at this time. And this is the stuff that people found really funny. It's a slapstick. And we saw a lot of slapstick. And the color is really exciting and new. And action, he really picks up on the way in which Wilhelm Busch describes action with speed lines and gestures, and really brings that into the Katzenjammer Kids. So Wilhelm Busch plays an important and significant role in the development of American comics. Winsor McCay was another extraordinarily talented artist who had a phenomenal energy and incredible ambition to bring an amazing degree of artistry into everything he did. He did a whole series of independent comic strips called Dreams of a Rarebit Fiend. Let me unpack that title for you. This is a dream by a person who has eaten that night rarebit, which is an alcohol-laced cheese fondue. And because of this rich food they've just ingested, they are now having this nightmare. And they always begin with someone doing something relatively ordinary, going up in an elevator, but then the elevator's going faster, it crashes through the roof, and then the guy in the elevator is getting so fat that the elevator explodes, and then the fat man becomes a shriveling figure. It's visually an absolute wonder to see all that action on a single page. And the last frame is always the poor guy waking up and complaining about his indigestion. Winsor McCay created some of the most vibrant and brilliant color pages for the Sunday Color Supplement ever seen in human history. They are really astounding, imaginative, and an absolute wonder to behold. He did Little Nemo in Slumberland from 1905 to 1911, and then In the Land of Wonderful Dreams from 1911 to 1915. And all of these works are just an explosion of beautiful colors and dreamlike forms. And the last frame, always tucked down, is this little boy, Nemo, waking up and complaining to his mom, "Oh, Mom, I just had this great dream. Do I have to wake up?" So the conceit was really simple. We never really get to know who Nemo is. He's a bit of a nothing, and that's what the word Nemo means. Traditionally, it's Latin for nothing. And so Nemo is just a conceit, a way in which Winsor McCay can get to draw all these fantastic, imaginative characters. But it also says something else, that within every ordinary person is an incredible imagination. Here is probably Winsor McCay's most famous page of Little Nemo in Slumberland. Nemo is in his bed, and his bed begins to transform. It sprouts legs, it walks out the door, it starts galloping down the street, and then it stumbles across the rooftops, and he tumbles down, and the very last frame, he's fallen out of bed. And it almost brings you right back to the very first panel, right? This idea of this endless cycle of waking and sleeping. And it's just an absolute tour de force. I love the rhythms of the movement, the way the moon appears behind all the action. It's just a gorgeous page, really a wonder to behold. Winsor McCay, of course, wasn't just drawing pictures. In the evening, when he wasn't drawing, he would go and join the vaudeville circuit, which was a bunch of theaters there you could go and entertain people with magic tricks or comic routines or singing, you name it. All kinds of performers could be found in vaudeville. And what Winsor McCay did were these chalk talks, where you would get up there with a blank page And with just a brush and ink, he could quickly draw anything. I mean, literally anything. He could take his characters and show them in any kind of way. Or someone would come up and he could do a quick caricature of them. One of the ways he wanted to employ this further, these chalk talks, as they were called, was that he wanted to have something, so it wasn't him drawing all the time. He began to create this animated feature, and that he would project the animated feature, and then he would interact with it. And for that, he created Gertie the Dinosaur in 1909, and this is one of the early animated films. There have been a few other people before it, but his artistry and his industry in creating so many thousands of pictures for his animated cartoon. This dinosaur would come out of his cave, and then he would talk to the dinosaur, and he would tell the dinosaur to do something, and then the dinosaur animation was timed to actually do it. And people were flabbergasted. They couldn't believe it. They're like, where did he get a dinosaur from? They didn't understand how he could get this dinosaur to do what he was saying. I mean, this idea of animation was just so new that it was really unbelievable to people. And this is where it really takes off. So, just to recap, we've talked a lot about different kinds of narrative modes. And I know this is not a subject that anybody has ever really been introduced to in any detail. So let me recap this as simply as I can. To begin with, in ancient times, we have certain kinds of narrative modes that were very common. They were the linear narrative. That's where you have a series of pictures that are telling a story, one picture after another. We have a continuous narrative. We have a long strip of pictures with repeated characters telling a story. And then you have the monoscenic narrative, where you have the single picture, a picture that tells the whole story in one picture, sums it all up. And the artists we've talked about who do that monoscenic narrative are Daumier, the caricaturist, and Thomas Nast, we were just looking at. Both of those guys, caricature is very often this monoscenic narrative. One picture tells the whole story. Then we get back to Hogarth and his consequential narrative. It's different than linear narrative because now you actually have a cause and effect, a linking action that connects all the pictures. The pictures are not arranged thematically, but there's this real story being told out, an original story being told out in pictures. Okay, so this is the consequential narrative. Hogarth, Thomas Rawlinson, George Cruikshank, Heinrich Hoffmann, all are people who worked with this idea of the consequential narrative. The other one that's really interesting, the sort of mid-new invention, was the metamorphosis. We looked at J.J. Granville. That's where you have a series of pictures that transform over space, right? It's not really time. They're just changing, and we can follow those changes, and we can see how one thing leads visually to another. We really get to the modern world of picture storytelling with Rudolf Topfer's sequential narrative. Here, the frame of the picture is changing, and there's multiple pictures per page, and the size and shape and orientation of the framed picture changes the way we read it and understand it. And the artists who did this, of course, Topfer, who invented it, Doré, who followed him, Wilhelm Busch, who picked up on this, Marie Duval, who explored it in other ways, and of course, we just looked at the brilliant Winsor McCay. These are all sequential narratives. Okay, they all are following pictures in action to action, movement to movement, in a way that it's unfolding before our eyes. Okay, I hope that recap clarifies some of these different narrative modes that we've been talking about.